So my name's Hugh Simpson-Wells with Oxford Computer Training. I'm actually the founder of Oxford Computer Group, but I spend most of my time nowadays generating training content and running webinars and so on. So this webinar calls itself HR-driven provisioning of Active Directory and Azure AD made easy. But really what I'm going to be talking about is a video training series that we put together called Enabling the Cloud Through Hybrid Identity. Amounts to much the same thing. I'm going to be talking to you about how the video series can help you, but first of all, I am going to need to set the stage, and so I'm going to spend some time talking about the particular problem we're trying to solve. This is a particular scenario that we've focused these training videos around. So I want to talk about the problem and what the solution is. Then tell you about how our video-based training course can help you with this particular scenario. Part of the solution will be, and I've misspelt it there, apologies, Microsoft Identity Manager, which I'll refer to from now on as MIM. I need to explain why MIM is still important after nearly 2 decades and with its ultimate demise in sight, but why that is still important and relevant. I'll of course show you how the video series works and how that's going to help you. But first of all, I want to check that this is the right webinar for you. So my first basic assumption is that you are using Azure AD. Now this is a pretty safe one. Almost nobody now who's a Microsoft software user is not using Azure AD in some form. And the key thing here is that we have users that want to use Azure-based apps, and they're using the directory Azure AD for various reasons. It might be an internet app, it might be an Azure app. Very likely it's going to be Office 365, which of course is the productivity suite, which is intimately associated with Azure AD. And what's Azure AD doing for us? Well, first of all, it's keeping information about users. It's also keeping information about groups of users. So first of all, it's going to provide authentication, who is this user? Secondly, it's going to provide authorization information. Group memberships and other mechanisms are important for deciding what you can do in these various applications. First basic assumption then is you're using Azure AD. Second basic assumption is you're also using AD. And we would assume that you had AD first and you've got Azure AD. And in just the same way as we want to be able to use cloud-based applications and provide authentication and authorization in respect of those, we want to use legacy apps, on-premise applications, and in much the same way, we're still perhaps needing to use the on-premises directory, AD, again for both authentication and authorization purposes, because again, not only are we keeping information about the users, but we're keeping information about the groups of those users. So which groups are they in can be used to control what they can do. Now, it does not make sense to maintain these two independently, and so we're fully expecting that there'll be some way in which we can synchronize the information between these two. And Microsoft have provided Azure AD Connect for us to do this. And I imagine that the vast majority of people that are using AD and Azure AD are already using Azure AD Connect because it's pretty simple to implement. That, though, is very much part of the scenario that we're going to be talking about. And so our video series absolutely will cover not only how to implement it, but how to choose the right version, because there's more than one version. At the moment, that's sitting in limbo between on-premises and cloud, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. But an issue here is in which direction, what's the direction of travel of the information? Now, largely for historical reasons, the direction of travel tends to be to the right. Sorry, I've missed a bit out. What is it, first of all, that we're synchronizing? User information, possibly including password hashes, not actual passwords, but to all intents and purposes passwords, so that the same password hash is available. The Also groups, very, very important to synchronize groups for exactly the reasons I've said, so that the same information is available for authorization purposes at both ends, reliably and consistent. And also perhaps devices, so that devices, computers then typically, which are domain joined, can become cloud joined and so are trusted in the cloud as well. Direction of travel then. Usually people started with AD and they've got Azure AD. Not surprisingly, therefore, we see the direction of travel as being fundamentally from left to right. And that is going to be my assumption, that we are talking about locally mastered accounts at the moment. So in other words, it is the AD that is authoritative and information is flowing to Azure AD. Now, of course, we can imagine it the other way around. And ultimately, we can imagine AD not being there at all and an organization becoming fully cloud. But in this intermediate state, typically we're locally mastered. As I say, we can imagine perhaps it becoming cloud mastered later before becoming fully cloud. That isn't really quite possible yet. The tools are not quite available yet for password write back, but we would fully expect, for write back of data. So I shouldn't have said password write back. That is absolutely available. For writing back user information, for example. Certain amount of group write back and device write back is available, but the full capability to cloud master and write back to AD, it's coming along. It's not with us yet. So this is one of my fundamental assumptions, that we are hybrid AD, and by that I mean we're locally mastered with on-premises AD, feeding information via Azure AD Connect to Azure AD. Quick detour here. We've talked about users being synchronized, and I've mentioned perhaps password hashes being synchronized. That gives us a same sign-on. So a user will be able to use the same username and password on premises and cloud, assuming that we actually synchronize the account name, the UPN probably. We would also get single sign-on under the right circumstances, depending on how everything's configured. But there is also pass-through authentication, and there is a reason for me mentioning this because it comes up later. So I just want to get this quickly out of the way, that if you're using pass-through authentication, not only are you able to authenticate in the normal way locally, when you authenticate through the cloud, to the cloud, when you ask Office to authenticate you through Azure AD, actually what happens is it gets passed back, it gets passed through to a local agent, which gets the authentication done, and that then passes back again. What's going on there is that AD becomes the authority in both cases. Wherever you sign on, whether it's in the cloud or locally, it's actually AD that's the authority. Certain advantages in that, for example, the same policies are being used in both cases, and working time policies, for example, would be available. Slight disadvantage, if AD is not available, you can't sign on in the cloud. Okay, so there's more than one method of authentication there, and that quick detour is necessary because it comes up later. My third basic assumption is that you have a source of truth. Now, this should not be surprising. Nearly every organization is going to have an HR system, or perhaps a student registration system, or something along those lines. And in the same way that we could imagine wanting to synchronize AD with Azure AD, we would want to synchronize these. Now, many organizations will have put in place a script or some way of bulk transferring data from their HR system, or whatever their source of truth is, to AD, in order that AD is based on reliable information. I say reliable information, very often an HR system is the most reliable information in an organization, because so many things depend on it, things like payroll and so on. It's something where we do tend to focus our attention, and so the data tends to be reliable. Now, before we talk about how we synchronize that, I think I should just mention that I'm assuming, this is my next assumption for first part of my next assumption, which is it's not a cloud HR system. If you've got a cloud HR system like Workday or SuccessFactors, This is probably not the webinar for you, because there are mechanisms for dealing with that. The Azure AD provisioning service is capable of taking cloud HR systems, and an increasing number of them, and directly synchronizing those with Azure AD in the case that we're cloud only, or via Azure AD Connect with AD, and then synchronizing back to Azure AD. That's not where we're going. So 4B is, I'm assuming that your source of truth is on premises. Okay, so here's the basic, the fundamental scenario that I'm talking about. You have AD, you have Azure AD, you have a source of truth. We want to have synchronization. We want to have HR-driven provisioning, and not just provisioning, but maintaining the updating attributes and group memberships and so on right across this estate. And of course, we need something to do that synchronization, and that something is MIM, and we'll come back to that in just a second. But what we want is, if somebody new arrives, here's a red person who's just arrived here, we want them to be provisioned to AD and onto Azure AD. If they change in some way, they move to a different department, their job title changes, something changes about them, we want that change to be propagated. If they get disabled, or they leave the company, whatever, they could be marked as deleted. We would expect to see deletions take place. It may also be that you have an actual deletion in HR, but let's not get involved in that debate right now. So we are basically saying that we want the identity lifecycle to be managed. We want joiners, movers, and leavers in HR to be reflected in these two directories. And as I say, it is Microsoft Identity Manager, it is MIM that's going to do this. Why? Well, because that's the tool which Microsoft provides to do it. And although you may have heard that MIM is coming towards the end of its life, it still has a valuable part to play, particularly in this scenario. And it's not illogical to use it for this purpose, to ensure that as you go into the cloud, that the data that you're putting there is reliable and sensible. So those are my assumptions, and let's just review them. You're using Azure AD, using AD, so it's hybrid AD, it's locally mastered, and you have a source of truth. And actually, I'm going to say a single source of truth, because if we're going to have multiple sources of truth, we really are moving into a more complex area, and that is hard to deal with in the format that we've done the format of this video series. Now, the benefits of automation, I've kind of alluded to them, but let's be clear about what they are. We want consistent identity data based on our source of truth. Reduced administration, that's really two parts. I mean, first of all, not having to actually enter the data in 2 or 3 different places. Secondly, not having to clear it up again when you've made a mess of it. So reduce administration from this automation. Enhance security and compliance, because authentication, authorization decisions can be based on reliable data. And the compliance side of it, I wrap up in a term I like to use, is you know what you know. The information you have is reliable. It's not, you're not looking at a directory which is unreflective of the real situation. An enhanced user experience, timely access to applications that users need, and same or single sign-on. So these are some of the benefits. Now, most of that should be fairly clear. But before we get down to what the videos do and what do they look like and how they're going to be used, we need to mention that there are 2 versions of Azure AD Connect. Azure AD Connect Classic sits on premises. It is a more capable but older and slightly more cumbersome to implement tool. So that's the on-premises version. And then we have the Cloud Sync version, which has a lightweight agent on premises, but fundamentally it sits in the cloud. So we have 2 versions, and gradually Azure AD Connect Cloud Sync is being developed to include more and more capabilities, and one can imagine it becoming the go-to tool at some point. To compare these 2, my very simple comparison is that Azure AD Connect Cloud Sync is very simple to install and configure. In fact, you don't really have to install it, you just have to configure it. It synchronizes users and groups, though not devices, but that may be quite enough for many, many organizations. It does support the special case of disconnected directories. By disconnected, we mean forests, AD forests really, that cannot see each other. They're not on the corporate network, for example. But it doesn't support pass-through authentication. So if that's important, that is a showstopper for Azure AD Connect Cloud Sync. The Azure AD Connect Classic version is less simple to install and configure. Usually, I say usually because sometimes it's just a matter of loading a wizard and going next, finish. But it does have way more configuration options that you could get involved with. It does support pass-through authentication. It does synchronize devices. It can handle larger groups than the Cloud Sync version, and it can support more complex multi-forest scenarios. For example, if you want to combine users that are represented in multiple forests, or if you want to combine memberships of groups from different forests, those kinds of things can be supported by this version. And there are many other configuration options, such as handling custom attribute flows and things. Now, if you want, this is changing all the time. Microsoft are very often issuing updates to Cloud Sync with giving it further capabilities. So it's well worth going and checking the latest situation. I just refer you to Microsoft's excellent documentation. You'll easily find a comparison of the two, sort of bullet comparison. So just a reminder that we've been talking about Azure AD Connect Classic on premises, Azure AD Connect Cloud Sync in the cloud. So now on to the video training and what we're trying to do. We feel that this is a simple enough scenario that we can provide how-to videos which allow you to do this for yourself. In a more complex situation, we would absolutely recommend that you go to an implementer, you get help to do it. But we felt that we could offer an end-to-end, step-by-step guide for this particular scenario. And that's what we've done. It's 17 videos, that shouldn't really say including this one, that's a mistake. 17 videos, about 8.5 hours of, well, frankly, me talking. It covers both versions of Azure AD Connect and helps you decide which is the right one. It covers everything you need to know about how to get it up and running, and we think that you can take a watch and do approach. In other words, you watch a chunk of it, there's a bit of theory in PowerPoint, then there is a lot of demo practice of it actually being done. We don't provide a lab, so we don't provide you with an environment to do it in or give you labs. We assume that what you can do is implement it alongside the videos, rewind, replay, watch whichever bit is relevant. If you want to more fully understand the whole of Azure AD Connect, for example, or the whole of MIM, well, we have other courses which are quite a lot longer to do that. And these are the 17 videos. Now, they are somewhat dependent. The intention is that you do follow through more or less 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on, with some exceptions. So the exceptions go like this. First of all, if you just want to understand everything about and to really understand both Cloud Sync and the Classic version, you go through in this order. You do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then all of these, and then you would install Azure AD Connect Classic instead to see how that works before going on to the final video, which is about operating this all in place. The second journey is where you've decided that Classic is right for you. You, for example, need pass-through authentication, or you need some feature which is not available in Cloud Sync. So you've decided you don't need Cloud Sync. You do 1, 2, 3. Then you jump up to 15 and 16. It's been made so that this still works. And then you run through the rest of it to implement MIM and so on. Or you decide, actually, Cloud Sync is good enough for me. I don't need to know about Classic. You do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then you miss out 15 and 16. Okay, so far so good. We can see how those videos flow in that way. But what you'll spot is that a huge chunk of this is about MIM. And this is a little bit inevitable because MIM is a very big tool with some very big general capabilities. And it isn't possible to package it up in the same way as Azure AD Connect or the other things that we talk about, where you can simply say, implement this, switch this on, run this wizard or whatever. It is a large chunk of the work, and it's honestly what most of this video series is about. Because MIM is a pretty big, scary thing, and most organizations would get somebody in to get an organization in to implement it for them. So I need to talk a little bit about what MIM's for, just to make this clear. MIM, generally speaking, is going to connect to lots and lots of probably on-premises systems. Some of them could be in the cloud, but probably on-premises systems. And it's going to synchronize users and groups and other things between them. But we're going to focus here on users. And it's going to make the necessary transformations of data between them. So it's, for example, going to go to an HR database, which is likely to be a source of truth, pull information from that and perhaps modify it slightly in order to provide it in the way it's needed in other systems. By the way, it's not simply synchronizing attributes, it is synchronizing the object. It's creating the objects and it's removing the objects when they're not wanted. So fundamentally, in a full implementation, it's going to connect to lots and lots of things. And it's particularly good at, for example, handling multiple sources of truth and multiple forests. But in our simple case, we're not going to be getting involved with that. Yes, there is such a thing as a full implementation. We're not doing that. Our simple scenario only has two connectors. Actually, they're called management agents, but it doesn't matter. Two connectors. We're simply taking stuff from the HR database, pushing it into Active Directory. So we're using a very cut down case, a very cut down scenario, not anything like the normal full scenario. Now, you might very reasonably say, something that my father's actually rather fond of saying, it is in a sense a sledgehammer to crack a nut. Because really, generally speaking, MIM is doing a much bigger job than we're asking it to do. But it does do the job very well. It isn't easy to find another tool, certainly within the Microsoft camp, that does the job. And the cost of it is in any case included in the Azure AD premium licensing. So if you're able to do this yourself, you can do this fairly cheaply. Now, some organizations are still doing full implementations of MIM, but we're absolutely not suggesting that this is the right way to go for everybody. And we are suggesting that you'd be advised to seek an implementation partner. We're suggesting this very limited scenario, and this is the scenario that our videos will take you through. And by the way, we're here with additional support if required, if you get to a part of it which you don't fancy. The videos themselves then, what do they look like? As I say, they're fundamentally me talking. And they involve a certain amount of PowerPoint to set the scene, to explain principles and so on. As I've already said, there aren't any labs. We don't provide an environment. That's one of the reasons we've been able to keep the price down. Lots of demos. So we do absolutely end-to-end coverage of the whole solution, the whole thing demoed. Now, MimSync does require, this is the synchronization engine within MIM, does require a small amount of code. We take you through this too, but if you find that that's an area that you really can't get comfortable with, well, we're here to support you through that if necessary. But the whole thing can be done on a watch and do basis, end to end, and I'm pretty sure there isn't anywhere else that you're going to find this at all, let alone whether you're going to find something as good and comprehensive. So that's it. I've as quickly as I can gone through what the particular scenario is that we're addressing with these videos and how those videos address them. You can find out more about the video series by going to our website. Easiest thing to do, I put it because the web address is quite long, is simply go there on the main menu, choose courses, and then choose HR-driven provisioning here. I don't know whether you can see my mouse, HR-driven provisioning, that's the one. And then you can get to a trial video that you can try out, and you can sign up right there. Also, of course, come back to us through the usual channels. Come back directly to me if you like, Hugh at oxcomputertraining.com if you want to.